From CONK News at CONK.com, I'm Jim Peters, the editor-in-chief of CONK News, and welcome to this edition of CONK Interviews. Ken W. Good is an attorney based in Dallas, and he's a board member of the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. He's been advocating for both criminal justice reform and bail bonds reform, and we interviewed him a few days ago. We're going to play that interview just right after these messages from our sponsors. Okay, so I have an interesting question here. I've read through some of the papers you've written. My first question to you, I'm going to answer myself, and then I want you to let me know what you think of my answer, okay? You have a paper titled, Criminal Justice Reform, Do Advocates for Change Even Care About Results? That's the title of your paper. I'm going to answer the question, and the answer to the question is no. And the reason is because at least my take on this is that extreme liberals who are mature adults, it's basically a personality problem, a personality disorder, and they are so driven by their ideology that they can't accept the fact that an idea they have doesn't work. You've mentioned in several of your papers that usually these ideas are put into place that after a while, a year or so, 2 years, they obviously do not work, but the people propagating them keep saying, oh, they need more time, and the problem is they really don't work, and you can't convince the people who are advocating for them that these ideas have failed. They can't buy their own failure. That's my take on this. What do you think of that?
Well, I think you're absolutely correct, and I think probably the best example of your theory is the DA of L.A. in California, when his office says, we just have a different view of who the real victim is in these crimes. They don't think the person who had something stolen from them or had a loved one killed is the real victim. They think the real victim is the defendant in the court. And so, as a result, there's no one actually arguing for the victim, the person who is hurt, because they're saying that the real victim is the person who is in jail. And that's not sustainable in our society. That creates chaos. So we have to have somebody standing up and fighting for the victims of crime.
Ken, why do they think that? Is this?
I do think there's a coalition on the other side, and I don't think everybody in the coalition agrees. But I think part of that. I think part of the coalition wants chaos, and I think that's the extreme part of it. And I think there's some of the coalition just thinks that that poor people are being taken advantage of, and that people who commit a crime because they're poor should not be prosecuted. And I disagree with that fundamentally. I think our society, and historically, we take into consideration on punishment your circumstances. But the problem is what they're doing is they're setting up a complete system that's tying the hands of the judges of the district attorney's offices, and they're creating situations where career criminals can take advantage of the criminal justice system, where gangs can take advantage of the criminal justice system. And they think, well, that's okay because that's the cost of making sure that we protect these segments of our society. And that's the fallacy. When you set up a system where career criminals can take advantage of the criminal justice system, where really criminal justice becomes voluntary, because if you don't come, you don't get punished.
Okay.
You don't have a society.
But this is the part I don't get, because I do agree with you on that. I don't understand what is the point. Like you said, if there's a subset of the coalition that actually wants chaos, what is the end game of the chaos? I don't get this. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, why are they actually advocating for chaos?
Oh yeah, I do. I do think I have a theory on that, and I think we've gotten to the point where I think that will not be the case anymore. But for many election cycles, 6 months before an election, you would see some tragedy taken advantage of, and you would see all kinds of protests. And I think that there was a political overlay to a lot of that to make a certain segment of society angry, so they would come out in larger numbers to vote in a specific way in the upcoming election. I mean, if you look at a lot of these tragedies that we've had, just coincidence of coincidence, they're like 6 months before a national election. We've now reached the point where, these promises that they were making at one point just to get people to come out and vote their way, they're now electing people to follow through and carry through on those very promises that I don't think they originally intended. And so now we're seeing it to the point where that's actually turning off large segments of the society.
Yeah, so
I think this next election may be the first one where we don't have this type of a cycle come through, because I think we're now at the point where they're having a backlash from it.
Yeah, so you think this is actually backfiring on this, the people who are supposedly advocating this. And the other thing I want to ask you, too, from what you just said, now this is really interesting to me, because you're kind of implying or saying that their actual idea here is kind of more or less short term. I always thought that there was some grand plan somewhere for all this major chaos, but you really think you're basically saying it pretty much goes just to the next election? Is that kind of what you're thinking? It's short term?
I think that's how it started. Yes, I think that's how it started. Yes, sir.
You know, there's a lot of DAs that have been elected. I'll use DA as a general term, even though I know technically some of them aren't district attorneys, who have been elected across the country. I mean, there's a guy in Los Angeles. There's the woman in Chicago that seem to have they're being funded by, well, supposedly George Soros and a large left-wing contingent. And this is the thing I've never been able to understand either, Ken. Assuming Mr. Soros is doing this, going under that assumption, he seems like a very intelligent man. I don't understand what his end game would be for promoting these people. Do you get that, or am I just naive? Or
well, that's a good question. You know, because we're having some of that in Texas as well about supporting certain candidates, and I've even had candidates tell me that they were being asked to sign off on certain agendas, and when they refused, they still supported them. And so I think he comes from the standpoint, and I could be wrong here, but I think he comes from the standpoint of, if you're poor, you should not be prosecuted for being poor. And so because of your background, you should not be held accountable. And see, I think that's the fallacy. I would love to sit down with Soros, because I think that the focus is really wrong. The problems we have is in our urban areas, because we don't know how to prosecute large numbers of people through the jail quickly and efficiently. I think that's the big focus of the problem. And if you look at all the areas that we're having problems, they decided, well, historically we can't do individual magistration, because it's so expensive. So we look at alternatives. Bail schedules is one of them. That's been in litigation. And now, they don't like that, so we're just doing simple release. Well, that takes away all accountability. New York tried that. It was an utter failure, and they even repealed portions of it during the pandemic. New York put that up for vote, and it was rejected by the voters. And so just simple release is not an alternative. And so I think if you want to give a goodwill to these people, you would say they're struggling with how to process large numbers of people through the jail quickly and efficiently, and they're failing miserably because they're taking away all accountability.
So the interesting thing about that, Ken, is that I would go under the assumption as just a standard person who has nothing to do with law enforcement or criminal justice like you do per se, it would have seemed to me that the number of career criminals you'd be letting out by trying to advocate for the poor criminal is way bigger than the poor criminal that actually exists. Am I right about that? Is that your take on it, working with us?
Absolutely. Look at Harris County. It's a great example right now. With COVID going on and cases have not been processed for a year, we have a jail full of very dangerous people. And they're still having crime increasing substantially. They're having people who are out on multiple bonds commit murder, and the public is very upset about it. And the problem is, if they just, the judges are trying to work with the county to try to keep the population of the jail as low as possible, because the people in jail right now need to be there, and because they're the dangerous or the most dangerous, because they haven't been prosecuting crimes. But what do? Anything they do to start putting accountability back into the system is going to cause jail overcrowding. It's going to cause the problem to get worse before it gets better. What they don't realize is that's true any time they do it, because you got to show these people if they don't do what they're required to do, they're going to be held accountable. And until you do that, then they're just going to perceive it as a green light. So the situation will get worse before it gets better once our politicians get the backbone to do it. And they will eventually. I mean, you see that across the country where law enforcement is saying crime is going up because of bail reform.
Yeah, actually, let's talk about that. In a couple of your papers, you mentioned the fact that actually crime has been rising in America since like 2019, basically before all the stuff that happened the summer of 2020. Is that true? Did I get that right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You know, you can look at Harris County as a great example. Before the pandemic even started, they had implemented some of these changes, and their numbers of pending cases, we call it the docket, had doubled because they would slow down the process. People don't show up and they don't get punished and there's no accountability. So, I mean, it's just causing courts dockets to double. And right at the start of the pandemic, they had a presentation to the commissioner's court saying, well, they needed to dismiss between 12,000 and 18,000 felony cases just to prevent the criminal justice system from collapsing. So, forget about the victims. They're just saying to survive, we have to turn our back on 12 to 18,000 victims.
Right. So there is no like a mirage of crime that's happening that's skewing the narrative for the left or anything like that, where they're saying, oh, it's not that big a deal, right? That's the crime.
Well, they agree crime is increasing. They disagree as to the reason. Now, in New York, they agreed it was because of bail reform because that's the only change. Harris County, they don't agree it's because of bail reform. They think it's because of anything else other than bail reform. But I mean, come on. I mean, the only change in these big areas that we've had is pretty much the same change. It's all bail reform, and crime is consistently increased in the urban areas where it's been done. It's not increased in our, the rural areas, and that's for a reason.
So yeah, that's been pointed out to me too, and that's very true. There is no crime in rural America has not gone up, which is so the problem has to be somewhere. Do you think that maybe, or would you tell me, have we opened Pandora's box and let the cat out of the bag? Is it going to be hard to stop this at this point?
No. And, I met with one of the plaintiff's attorneys that are, behind some of these lawsuits that are pushing for these reforms. And I told him, I said, look, do you even realize what you're doing? You're creating an unsustainable situation. So no matter what happens, it will not last because it cannot be sustained. And you're seeing that now. The Texas legislature is a great example. They're looking at bail reform, but it's good bail reform. It has a strong component of accountability in it. And you're going to see pushes for that across the country.
Ken, very briefly, what makes up good bail reform? Just an outline.
Well, I would say the first component is accountability. Bail reform that says, well, you don't have to come to court. If you don't miss court, you're not going to be punished. We just, like Harris County, they were looking at, well, we're going to give you a free phone. We're going to give you free daycare. We're going to give you free rides to the court just to kind of get you to come. Good bail reform has accountability in it.
Well, are professional criminals just laughing at these people? I mean, that we're going to give you all this stuff to come to court, ha ha ha, like F you.
Yes, there was a guy in New York that was arrested for his 80-something time.
Oh my God!
And as he was leaving court, he was quoted saying, "Bail reform is lit, love it." So yes, they're laughing at us.
Yeah,
absolutely, they're laughing at us.
Oh my God! Well, okay, very good. Here's another thing I'm going to ask you if you agree with me, and that is we're based in Minneapolis. So when the 3rd precinct during the George Floyd riots burned down and the mayor of Minneapolis decided that instead of defending the building, they abdicated, my sense that was the actual turning point nationally where every basically scumbag in America decided, oh my God, we can actually beat the police. Do you have any thoughts on this at all?
I do, and I think that was a terrible situation, and that was just undefensible or indefensible. And right after that, we had those big calls for defunding the police.
Right.
I mean, in Texas, we've now had some courts. I think maybe y'all had a court saying that they had to refund the police because they had to hire more police officers because
yes.
I mean, if you don't feel safe, what do you do? I mean, how are we a society if I don't feel safe? There's some philosophers that say that the reason why we compromise our personal goal of, obtaining all your power is for society. Well, if society can't protect us, then we go back to chaos.
Well, I brought this up. Go ahead. No, go ahead, please.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say I brought this up in a previous broadcast, but our mayor, Jason Fry, is a young man and relatively inexperienced at anything, really, as a lot of politicians are. A lot of people haven't done much. And I think his logic was, well, if we try to defend the building, even if we win, somebody's probably going to die. And I think in his mind he thought, well, I will avoid death by getting the police out of there and just letting them burn it down. But the problem with that is you empowered so many people nationally that I could argue that some of the deaths that happened over the summer, and God knows in these riots, I think at least 30 people got killed, something like that, that in some ways you can attribute those to him abdicating that building.
Well, we're going to have a problem. And we have currently, whether you agree or not, we have a double standard. Is you have one standard for your supporters, and then you have another standard for protests by your opponents. And that is a recipe for disaster. We have one standard being applied to the Capitol, whatever you want to call those protests, and you have a different standard applied here. And it's not going to work. And as long as we have that double standard where we don't have this moral base that we can all fall back on, there's going to be some type of, at the least we call it a protest, and the other side is going to call it a riot after every national election now. Because we now are at the point where we didn't lose, the election was stolen from us. And that's every 4 years. I mean, have we had an election in the last decade where the other side didn't at least say the election was stolen? That was what Hillary Clinton said, that her election was stolen.
Right.
And now it's to the point where, we've said it so often, why wouldn't your supporters go out and protest? At the very least protest. Why wouldn't they do more? And it's only a problem if one side does it. It's not a problem if the other. And that's the recipe for dynamite.
So here's a global question, Ken, just kind of even out of your purview, and that is, the government in America becomes so damn corrupt that this is irredeemable. Can we turn this back or not?
Well, I think you see the start of it being turned back across the country. You can see a government starting to rehire police, and you can see them starting to push back, or the voters are pushing back. Texas, the last election, supposedly, one party, that was not in power was supposed to finally take over the House, and they did not. And I think the consensus was it was because law enforcement came out and supported the other side, the party in power, because they were pro-law enforcement. And that was perceived to be what happened. You haven't seen Biden push bail reform like he said he was going to, and I think that in part because I think the numbers for the Democrats and what they've seen behind the scenes is devastating to them. If the election next year was today, I think they would be killed, especially in the House. So, and you've seen that. They've come out and said, well, we've never supported defunding the police. That's the Democrats. So that's them trying to change the narrative. And I think it's all because I think we've reached the tipping point. I think it's turning, and I think you may not see a protest turned into some big political issue to try to drive out, to get people out to vote in the next national election, because I think it's got to the point where it turns people off.
Well, I will just offer my personal comment here, too. This is all driven by a small percentage of people in our society who are basically completely freaking crazy. I mean, you were talking about, like, here in Minneapolis, a judge has ordered the Minneapolis City Council to refund the police, and they're fighting that tooth and nail. We have a president on the city council here. She's just flipping crazy. There's no other way to put it. I mean, it's like the sky is green, and I don't understand where people are coming from, and that's yeah, go ahead.
That's a great example, and there's another example too. This idea that just has been said over and over: we don't need to send police when there's a call. We need to send social workers out. And I'm like, that is ludicrous. Who's triaging that call?
Yeah.
And when the first social worker, when the second social, when the third social worker gets killed on a call from the county because they just tried to do a touchy-feely thing and they get killed by somebody high on drugs.
Yeah.
how is the county even going to be able to defend that situation?
Thank you. I've thought of that too. It's like, yeah, you send out the social worker and watch them get shot. It's like,
yeah.
I mean, God Almighty.
Well, and then they say, well, we're going to couple them together, have a social worker and an officer. Well, that's just double the cost. And then you've got, well, stand behind me because they have a gun. I mean, then we got to protect them. I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy. And here's what I think part of the problem is. I think it's completely an urban area issue. Schools have failed. Families have failed. Drugs are just rampant in the urban areas and the cities. And we're now with the protests, we're killing all businesses, and they're not coming back. So we're giving them even fewer opportunities. And the freaking politicians in many of these areas are just saying, isn't this great?
Ken,
so we need to give up everything and reform criminal justice to give up on that too.
I want to ask you, just like personally, how did you get interested in advocating for this stuff? Like, was there something driving you? Just like,
yes, there was a lawsuit that was filed in Harris County in Houston that was trying to push some of these reforms, and there was a pushback, and that kind of started the national movement. And we, me as an attorney, I kind of have an appellate background, so I like legal issues. And so I'm like, we're going to have to become experts on these issues because these people don't have any problem misrepresenting either data or the truth. We can come in and say, look, we have the best appearance rate. Everyone else has a 50% worse or even worse than that appearance rate. So if you want people to come to court, you need more people using us. If you don't care whether people come to court, well, then you don't need bail bondsmen who've been around for 200 years. And so I think that we've been forced to become experts on these issues because there's so much untruth being told.
Yeah, it is amazing, isn't it, how things have been working for hundreds of years, and you'd think that as society we would want to perfect things, and then all of a sudden these ideas that work for centuries are being thrown out. I just find that just hilarious.
Well, and that's why with these, with bail reform, you can't just find a middle ground because the two camps are so far apart. I mean, you look at this O'Donnell case, which is what got me started, and it's the greatest example because that case was won by the county. They took advantage of one small problem that they did not meet procedural requirements to protect the poor. And the Fifth Circuit said as long as those procedural requirements are put in place, you're good to go. What did our friends on the other side do? Oh, bail's been held unconstitutional in the United States because of this case. I mean, that was just out and out lie. And so we've had to become experts so that we can stop the lies. And then they switched to, well, it's just not fair to keep using this. And it's like, look, criminal justice is, we can't ever have a fair system of everybody's going to be treated on release exactly the same because if your numbers, we want to divert as many people away from magistration as we can so we can concentrate what little resources and time we have on the truly poor people. But the way they're creating chaos, we got to treat everybody the same. So we got to just try to figure out how to do it and do everybody, and that's impossible. That's the reason why we're having chaos.
Yeah, and there's a hidden fact in what you just said, and that is you can't treat everybody the same because people aren't the same.
That's right. That's the whole basis of our criminal justice system. We find out where you are, and we impose just enough punishment to get you on track, and then next time if you come back, we do more until we get you on track. We're now at the point where we're saying, well, we shouldn't do it. We should treat everybody the same. We should give them, we're discounting crime. And I know we are right now because of the pandemic. We didn't try cases for a year. But that's really where we are. We don't want to hold people accountable. In California, they did they passed a constitutional amendment. So if you steal something up to $900-something, you won't be prosecuted.
Right. Oh, yeah. We've all seen the pictures of people walking out of Walgreens with their hands full and just walking out. I mean...
When the Walgreens are closing because of it, and then worse, you go to Walmart, they have nobody working there because they have a $15 minimum wage, they can't afford them, and everything's locked behind, gates, so you have to wait forever to get somebody to come out to unlock something for you to get it. Because
I would say that's not civilized.
It's not. And really, I would even say we're doing a disservice to these people as well because we're giving them a green light, and so they take the green light and start committing more and more crime, and then they go on a path where when the criminal justice system finally decides to hold them accountable, now they're looking at a lot more severe punishment than if the criminal justice system had just done their job and got them back on track when they were doing very small things.
That's a very good point. That's an unintended consequence. I never really thought of that, but that's a very good point on your part. Thank you. We'd like to thank Ken W. Good for joining us on this edition of CONK Interviews, a production of CONK News at CONK.com. I'm Jim Peters, the editor-in-chief of CONK News. Thanks for joining us.